baptism marking the entrance to the church and having a formal church role or a formal church membership, is that something that was always in place? Did that develop over time? What does it mean to be a church member? Does it really matter? Baptism's required. Is church membership important or not important?
Really good question, Austin. No, they've all been good questions.
Well, I asked that one instead of who's your favorite associate pastor. So I think I chose right. Sorry, keep going.
Okay, look. We started a series of articles on the Grace to You website over the last week or so on church membership. I haven't seen anything that's been posted on the Grace to You website that's generated the response that this discussion has. And we've done some very dynamic things on there, gotten some response. We've done some very controversial things, as you would imagine. We've confronted all kinds of issues there. I haven't seen anything that generated as much response as this discussion about church membership. It has brought all kinds of people out of the woodwork, some who they fall into these categories. You know, I think you're right. I think this is absolutely right, but I can't find a church that I'm willing to join. To, where do you get this stuff? This is ridiculous. You're imposing this on the Bible. This has nothing to do with it. You have entire movements that disdain church membership. One, for example, is Calvary Chapel. There isn't a Calvary Chapel in existence in the world that has church membership. They deny that has anything to do with the New Testament or the believer's responsibility. You have other movements like that don't have anything to do with church membership. So there's a lot of viewpoints floating around. But let me make it simple. I don't think the New Testament knows anything about a Christian that doesn't belong to a local assembly. And by belong, what do I mean? I simply mean who is fully identified with a local body of believers. For example, and it all begins in places like this. It's so assumed in the New Testament that it doesn't need to be commanded. For example, when the first group of believers gathers in the city of Jerusalem, it says there's 120 of them. Well, who knew that? Who had the list?
Somebody's counting.
Somebody's counting. And on the day of Pentecost, there were 3,000 who were men. So they not only 3,000 men, and further into the fourth chapter, there were 5,000 men. So they knew who the men were. And in an Old Testament way, they marked the men because they were the leader of the family and the women and children would follow. So they not only knew who they were, they knew what sex they were. They knew they were men. They had lists. Widows, if you keep going in the book of Acts, were to be ministered to by the church if they were on the list. So they knew who the families were, they knew who the men were, they knew who the widows were who were on the list. And the widows who were on the list, according to 1 Timothy 5, were to be cared for by the church. When a believer went from one community to the next, they would carry a letter of recommendation from a group of believers where they had been to the group of believers where they were going. So they went from church to church, and the story of their testimony came by letter as they carried a letter from one congregation to another congregation, so that congregation could embrace them. That kind of assumption is made throughout the entire New Testament. The epistles are written to the church at Philippi, to the church at Colossae, to the churches in the region of Galatia, to the church at Thessalonica. The assumption is those churches had elders, those churches had deacons. In some cases, like with Philippi, they had prophets at that time before the transition. They knew who their people were. Also, you can look at it from the other side. In Hebrews 13, the people are told to submit to those who are over you in the Lord. That's a formal relationship. There were some people who were literally over them in the Lord. That means the church membership says, I belong and I submit. I belong to this body of believers. I belong to this assembly of believers. I identify with them, and I come under the authority and the leadership of these shepherds and pastors. I think it would have been sort of unnecessary and kind of radical and uncommon for somebody in the New Testament epistles to say, oh, by the way, join a church. It was assumed. Forsake not the assembling of yourselves together, as the manner of some is, and much the more as you see the day approaching. What is the life of the church? What is the duty of the church member? The duty of the church member is to serve one another, pray for one another, love one another. The duty of the church member is to grow in grace and in the knowledge of Christ under the teaching of the Word of God, to yield his or her soul up to the shepherding of those who have been given the oversight over them. And again, Hebrews says you want to submit to them so they do their shepherding without grief, because they have to give an account for this. So while it identifies the accountability of the member, it also identifies the accountability of the shepherd. Somebody came to, I can't remember who it was, it may have been A.W. Tozer and some young pastor, and said, my congregation is too small. And he said, maybe they're as large as you'd like to give account for in the day of judgment. Mm. So while there's accountability on the member side, there's accountability on the shepherd side. And I think God models that. God models that in Matthew 18, where he says, if you have 100 sheep and one goes, you go after that sheep. Because all heaven is concerned about that one. So I just think the assumption of the New Testament is that people belonged. They belonged at Colossae, they belonged at Thyatira, at Pergamos, and even those troubled churches. Blessed are those who have not stained their garments, he says, in those troubled churches. So, this is counterculture right now.
Right.
Really counterculture. Because you got this freewheeling, independent thing. Dr. Sinclair Ferguson, talking at our Truth and Life conference this week, and in a kind of a private little Q&A that we had, said you go back to Friedrich Schleiermacher, sort of the father of liberalism. What he did, this would have been his 18th century, you go back to him, a German guy, and he turns Christianity on its head. And he goes from making Christianity all about Christ to making Christianity all about us, all about self. This is part of the Enlightenment, right? You turn from the church, the dark ages where the church dictates everything. You turn to self. This is the Enlightenment. And in the Enlightenment, we discover man's mind, and then you have Thomas Paine and the Age of Reason, and everything turns to man. And the church becomes man-centered, and that's what liberalism is. So the legacy is that. Well, you have the same thing happening in the market-driven church. It's the legacy of Schleiermacher. It's the legacy of generations and generations of a self-centered church. You can hear some people who are even evangelical preach. Listen to them on the television. All they ever talk about is the benefits to the people sitting out there. If you're in pain, if you're in suffering, Jesus wants to heal your wounds. It's all about you. I get so weary of this. Or if you're poor, he wants to make you rich. Or if you're sick, he wants to heal you. You hear it all the time, sometimes from charismatics, sometimes from non-charismatics. You would think that everything in the Christian church is geared to you rather than Christ. And the church is a dispensary to meet my needs. Very selfish. Now, how do you get people to sacrificially give their lives to minister to somebody else when that's the mentality? So they aren't Christ-focused, they aren't other-focused. They're self-absorbed. And what happens then is you get people just flitting over here, going there. I like the music over there. It's cool music over there. The guy's a cool dude over here. I like this guy over here because I like liturgy, blah, blah. And that suits that independent, it's about me mentality. I was reading an article by, I'm going to talk about this probably at Shepherd's Conference, David Wells, who has been a friend through the years, and he hit on something that I've been saying for a long time, and there's this modern mantra that's coming out of young ministers is the church has failed, the church has failed. Look at our culture, it's a mess, it's a disaster, it's immoral, look how horrible it is. Now we've elected all these immoral people to run our country, the church has failed, the church has failed. If the church has failed, it has failed in one area. It has failed in one area and one area alone, and that is it's failed to be biblical. It's failed to be biblical. It's failed to be God-centered, Christ-centered. That's its failure. The church can't convert the lost. Only God can do that. Only the gospel can do that. Only the word can do that. The church can't fix the world. The world's not going to get fixed. America's not going to get fixed till Jesus comes. If the church has failed, it has failed to be God-centered, Christ-centered, Word-centered. That's where its failure lies. So we have a self-centered culture of people that treat the church like movies or rock and roll concerts. They go where the action is, rather than committing themselves to a place where Christ is honored, God is honored, the Word is exalted, and pouring their lives into people there sacrificially. That just doesn't fit the modern mood at all. And the latest group of kids is worse than the previous one. More self-centered, more self-absorbed. So you're going to have another generation of these self-absorbed people growing up. Doesn't speak well for church membership in the future, because belonging assumes responsibility, accountability, faithfulness, ministry, fellowship, caring, sacrificing. But that's what the church is. That's what the church does. And the payback is, for all that you give, you get that all back again. And in the dynamics of the life of the church. I'm very concerned that a lot of young guys are having repeated events on weekends that attract people based on the music that aren't churches, but they call them churches, and they're not pastors because they aren't pastoring, they aren't shepherding. And they're appealing to people on a popular cultural level rather than on the level of what the church is. Why should we not forsake the assembling of ourselves together? Because we like the music? We should not forsake the assembling of ourselves together in order that we can stimulate one another to love and good works. That's the issue.
So there's
I would just say one other thing. I know you haven't asked about it, but I want to say this. There's a really important book, and I've talked to you about it, called The Juvenilization of the Church. The Juvenilization of the Church is a book it was a dissertation, but it goes back in the 1950s when Youth for Christ was begun, and Young Life, and I guess a little after that, Campus Crusade started here at UCLA. And the idea was, we're going to lose kids. It was in the 1950s that the youth culture began to separate a little bit from parents. Up to that point, families were families. Families were families. And all of a sudden, the youth culture began to be isolated and marketed to. And so there were people who thought, we're going to lose this youth culture unless we start tweaking what we do. And so instead of a church service, they started having a youth service. And then they had a Youth for Christ service. And it was completely different than the church service. And here we are 60 years later. And now, church is designed for junior hires. Church is designed for junior hires. And I tell people all the time, we do adult church here. We do adult church for adults and young people. I don't need to treat you like junior high students. I don't need to entertain you. I don't need to drive your emotions with a bunch of racket and noise. I don't need to do that. This is adult church. We think, we reason, we look at the Word of God, we contemplate it, we meditate on it seriously. This isn't junior high. And I think there's so much of that out there that is basically driven at the emotion and entertainment that feeds this self-centered kind of thing, I want what I like, that this is an uphill climb, church membership, but it's right.